My name is Claire Donovan. I am 31 years old. 3 days ago, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room when I saw something that made my entire world stop. My mother was in a quiet corner of that hallway, crying softly, while a man I had never seen before held both of her hands in his. He leaned in close and whispered something, and she nodded, wiping her eyes. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. So I did something I never imagined I would do. I took out my phone and I recorded it. Then I called my father. And what happened in the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my family. But before I tell you what really happened, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Heartway Stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My father had been sick for almost 8 months. It started with what the doctors called fatigue and unexplained bruising, and for weeks my parents just thought he was overworking himself. My father had always been that way, the kind of man who never slowed down, never complained, never asked for help. He ran a small landscaping business for over 20 years. He was up before sunrise every single day. So when he started losing weight and sleeping through the afternoons, my mother was the first one to worry. She made him go to the doctor. And that visit changed everything. The diagnosis came in late October. Acute myeloid leukemia. I remember the exact moment my mother called me. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, and the way she said my name before she even got to the words, I already knew something was wrong. I sat down on the floor right there and just listened. She tried to stay calm, but I could hear her voice shaking underneath every sentence. She said the doctors had a plan. She said it was serious but treatable. She said we were going to get through this as a family. And we tried. God, we tried. My younger brother flew in from Denver. I drove the 4 hours from Cincinnati every other weekend. We set up a schedule so my mother would never be alone at the hospital for long stretches of time. My father went through 2 rounds of chemotherapy. He lost 22 pounds. He lost most of his hair. But even lying in that hospital bed with tubes in his arm, he still tried to make jokes. That was just who he was. The kind of man who made everyone else feel better even when he was the one suffering. By January, the news was harder. The chemotherapy was not working the way the doctors had hoped. His counts were not improving. His specialist, Dr. Harmon, sat us all down one afternoon in a small conference room off the oncology ward and told us that my father's best option, maybe his only real option, was a bone marrow transplant. He explained it carefully. He said they would need to find a donor who was a strong enough match. He said the process could take months. He said there were no guarantees. I remember looking at my mother during that meeting. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the doctor. She didn't cry. She didn't ask emotional questions. She just listened and nodded and asked practical things about timelines and percentages and what the next steps would be. I remember thinking how strong she was. I had always admired that about her. She was the kind of woman who fell apart in private and held everything together in front of the people she loved. After the meeting, she squeezed my hand in the hallway and told me not to worry. She said she was going to take care of everything. I believed her because she always did. What I didn't know was what taking care of everything actually meant. What she had already started doing. What she had been doing for weeks without telling any of us. Life settled into a difficult rhythm through February and into March. I was driving back and forth between Cincinnati and Columbus, trying to balance my job as a physical therapist with being present for my family. My brother was handling things remotely as best he could. My mother was at the hospital almost every day. We talked on the phone constantly, but our conversations were mostly logistical. How is he feeling today? What did the doctor say? Is he eating? We were all running on adrenaline and love and very little sleep. I noticed my mother seemed more distracted than usual in those weeks. She was always on her phone, which was unusual for her. She had never been someone who checked her phone constantly. Whenever I asked her about it, she would just say she was dealing with insurance things, paperwork, coordination with the transplant team. It made sense at the time. There was a lot of coordination involved. I didn't push. Then came the Thursday that broke everything open. I had driven up that morning because my father had a procedure scheduled in the afternoon, and I wanted to be there. My mother had told me she would meet me at the hospital at noon. I arrived a little early, maybe around 11:30, and went up to my father's floor first to check on him. He was resting, the nurse told me. Resting well. The procedure wasn't until 2, so I went back downstairs to wait for my mother. The main waiting area on the ground floor was busy that day. I found a seat near the window and was scrolling through my phone when something made me look up. I'm not even sure what it was. A movement in my peripheral vision. A feeling, maybe. The kind of instinct that doesn't have a name. And then I saw her. My mother was sitting in an alcove off the main hallway, one of those quiet recessed seating areas near the chapel entrance. She was not alone. A man was sitting across from her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked to be in his mid-40s, tall, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He was well-dressed, a button-down shirt, dark pants, like someone who had come from an office. And they were close. Close enough that their knees were almost touching. My mother was crying. Quietly, the way she cried when she didn't want anyone to notice. And this man reached out and took both of her hands in his and said something low and soft. She nodded. She looked up at him. And something passed between them that looked like relief. The kind of relief that comes from a long time of knowing someone. My stomach dropped completely. I sat there for a moment, unable to move. My mind started doing what minds do when they see something they don't want to interpret. It started looking for other explanations. Maybe it was a hospital counselor. Maybe it was someone from church. But something about the way they were sitting, the way he held her hands, the way she looked at him, it didn't feel like a counselor. It felt like something else. Something private. Something that had been going on for longer than this moment. I picked up my phone. My hands were not quite steady. I opened the camera and I recorded about 40 seconds of it. Just the two of them sitting there together, her crying, him holding her hands, leaning in close. Then I stopped the recording and stared at it. I called my brother first. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I was seeing, and I could hear the confusion in his voice, then the discomfort, then the quiet anger. He told me to call Dad. I told him Dad was resting, and I didn't want to upset him before a procedure. My brother said I was right to wait, but that someone needed to say something. He said maybe I should just go over there and see what was happening instead of assuming anything. But I couldn't make myself move. Because what if I was right? I sent the video to my brother. He watched it and went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "Who is that guy?" I didn't know. That was the thing. I had no idea who he was. And somehow that made it worse. I told my brother I was going to talk to her. He told me to be calm. I told him I would try. I stood up and walked across the lobby toward that alcove. My mother heard my footsteps and looked up before I reached her. The moment she saw my face, something shifted in hers. Her expression changed immediately, not into guilt exactly, but into something complicated. Something I couldn't read. The man looked up too. He didn't seem embarrassed. He seemed alert, watchful. I stopped a few feet away. I looked at my mother and I said, "Mom, who is this?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. She looked at the man beside her and then back at me. And then she said something I was not expecting. She said, "Claire, please sit down. I need to explain something." Her voice was so steady, so careful. That steadiness made something cold move through me. I sat down across from both of them. The man introduced himself. His name was Daniel Reeves. He said he had driven in from Pittsburgh that morning. He said he and my mother had been in contact for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I looked at my mother. 6 weeks, I said. You've been talking to this man for 6 weeks and you never mentioned him? Her eyes filled with tears. And then, quietly, she said, "He's a donor, Claire. He's a bone marrow donor. He's a potential match for your father." The world went very still. I heard the words. I understood the individual meaning of each one. but it took a moment for my brain to put them together in a way that made sense. Daniel Reeves sat forward slightly and spoke again, his voice quiet. He said that a mutual contact had connected them, that he was part of a donor registry and had been flagged as a possible match for my father months ago. He said that my mother had reached out to him directly after the transplant coordinator told her the match probabilities. He said they had been talking almost every day since, working through questions, going over medical details, navigating his concerns, and that he had come today because he had finally decided. He had agreed to donate. My mother's hands were still in her lap. Her face was wet. She looked at me and said, "I didn't tell you or your brother because I didn't want to give you hope and then have it fall through. I didn't want you to go through that. I didn't want your father to know there was a possibility unless it became real. Because if Daniel had said no, I didn't want any of us to carry that." She paused. Then she said, "I've been begging him, Claire. Every conversation for 6 weeks. Not in a way that was unfair to him. I tried to respect his choice every step of the way, but I was not going to stop trying. I was not going to let your father run out of options while I sat and waited." And then she did something that undid me completely. She turned to Daniel Reeves and, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she said, "Thank you. I don't have words for what you're giving my family." And Daniel looked at her and he said, "I have a daughter too." That was all he said. But I understood exactly what he meant. I sat there in that hospital alcove and I started crying. Not politely, not quietly, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep that you didn't know was that full. All the months of fear and helplessness and forced optimism and long drives and careful conversations and trying to be strong for my father, all of it came out at once. My mother reached over and put her arms around me, and I held onto her like I was 12 years old again. After a few minutes, when I could breathe again, I looked up and saw Daniel looking at the floor, giving us privacy in the way that decent people do. And I thought about how strange it was. This man who had driven 4 hours. This man who had spent 6 weeks in careful conversation with my mother. This man who had made a decision that required something enormous from him, something physical and significant and not without risk, for a stranger. I looked at my mother, and I said, "Why didn't you tell me? I would have helped you." And she looked at me with that expression she has, the one I have seen my whole life, the one that is equal parts love and stubbornness, and she said, "Because you already had enough to carry. And this was mine to do." That sentence hit me in a way I couldn't explain right then. I kept turning it over in my mind for the rest of that day and the days after. This was mine to do. As if she had taken on this impossible task in secret, not to hide something from us, but to protect us. As if her whole purpose in those 6 weeks had been to build something quietly in the dark so that we would only have to step into the light when it was ready. I thought about what I had seen from across that lobby. Her crying in a corner with a man I didn't recognize. The way I had looked at that moment and seen something that scared me, something that fit into a story I was afraid of. And then I thought about what was actually happening in that moment. My mother, who had not slept properly in months, who had held our entire family together while her husband fought for his life, who had coordinated insurance and schedules and doctor meetings and managed everyone else's fear while quietly, privately, relentlessly pursuing the one thing that might save him. I had almost called my father in that hospital room before his procedure and told him what I thought I was seeing. I had almost done that. And I sat with the weight of that near miss for a long time. Later that afternoon, after the procedure was done and my father was resting comfortably, my mother and I sat together in the family lounge down the hall. Just the two of us. I had deleted the video from my phone, but I told her I had recorded it. I told her I had sent it to my brother. I told her I had been ready to confront her in a very different way than what actually happened. I wanted to be honest with her about that. She didn't get angry. She just looked at me for a long moment and then nodded slowly. She said she understood. She said if she had seen the same thing, she probably would have done exactly what I did. Then she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "Claire, I spent so many years teaching you to protect this family. I can't be surprised when you do it." I didn't know what to say to that. I just took her hand. She told me then about the 6 weeks in full detail. How the transplant coordinator had flagged Daniel's registry information and told her there was a reasonable probability of compatibility, but that probability wasn't a certainty, and donor decisions were never guaranteed. How she had found a way to contact him through a patient advocacy organization. How their first phone call had lasted almost 2 hours. How he had asked her 100 questions about my father, about who he was, about what his life was like. How she had answered every single one with complete honesty. How she had not tried to manipulate him or pressure him, but simply told him the truth of their situation and let him decide. How he had called her back 12 days later and said he needed more time. How she had said, "Of course, take all the time you need." How she had waited, how he had called again. How they had talked about his own family, his fears about the procedure, the logistics. How she had connected him with the medical team directly so he could ask questions without going through her. How she had done everything she could think of to make it easier for him to say yes while always leaving the door open for him to say no. And how 3 days before I came to the hospital, he had called her and told her he was coming in to meet with the transplant team. He was moving forward. She had been on her way to meet him in that alcove when I arrived early. I asked her why she was crying when I saw them together. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that when Daniel walked through the door that morning, when she actually saw him in person for the first time after 6 weeks of phone calls, she had just lost it completely. She said it was the relief. She said it was the gratitude. She said she had been holding her breath for so long that when she finally let it out, she didn't know what else to do but cry. I nodded. I understood that kind of exhale. 2 weeks after that day, the full compatibility testing confirmed what the preliminary data had suggested. Daniel Reeves was a strong match for my father. The transplant team scheduled the procedure for early May. My father was told about Daniel and the conversation between those two men, which my mother told me about afterward because my father asked her to be there, was the kind of thing that is hard to put into words. My father, who, as I said, was not a man who showed emotion easily, apparently sat in his hospital bed and just looked at this stranger for a long moment. And then he said, very quietly, "Thank you for driving to meet my wife." Daniel said he was glad he did. I have thought a lot about what I saw that Thursday afternoon in the hospital lobby. I have thought about the gap between what something looks like and what it actually is. I have thought about how fast we move to conclusions when we are scared, how the fear of losing something can make us see threats everywhere, even where there are none, even where there is actually something extraordinary happening. My mother spent 6 weeks fighting for my father in the quietest, most invisible way imaginable. No one saw it, no one knew. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it so we would be impressed. She did it because he was her husband and because she was not going to stop until she had turned over every stone. I almost interrupted that. I almost walked into that hospital alcove and turned a moment of profound grace into something ugly. And I think about that a lot. Not to punish myself for it, because I know I was acting out of love and fear and the instinct to protect my family. But I think about it because it taught me something I did not expect to learn in a hospital waiting room. Sometimes the people we love are doing things we cannot see. Sometimes they are carrying weight in private that would break us if we knew the full measure of it. And sometimes the moments that look the most frightening from the outside are actually the moments when someone is doing the bravest, most loving thing they have ever done. The transplant went forward in May. My father is recovering. It is slow and it is not without its hard days, but the doctors are cautiously optimistic. He has more color in his face now. He made a joke last Tuesday that made my mother laugh so hard she had to leave the room. I stood in the doorway watching them and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like we were going to be okay. My mother never asked for credit. She never made a speech about what she had done. She just folded it back into the ordinary fabric of taking care of our family, the way she always did, the way she probably always will. But I know. And my brother knows now. And my father knows. And Daniel Reeves, a man from Pittsburgh who drove 4 hours and gave something of himself to a stranger because a woman he had never met called him and told him the truth of her family's situation and trusted him with it. That man knows too. I don't know exactly what I believe about the universe or fate or the reasons things happen the way they do. But I know that what I thought I was seeing that Thursday morning was not even close to what was actually happening. And I know that when I sat down on the floor of my kitchen 8 months ago and listened to my mother tell me my father was sick, she had already started building a bridge in the dark, long before any of us knew we were going to need it. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly gets to work and doesn't stop until it finds a way through. I have replayed that Thursday morning in my head more times than I can count. The image of my mother sitting in that hospital alcove, crying quietly while a stranger held her hands. The way my stomach dropped, the way my fingers moved almost automatically to open my camera, the way fear turned into a story inside my head before I even had any real information. What I understand now is that the story I was telling myself in those moments was built entirely out of love and terror. I was scared of losing my father. I was exhausted from months of driving back and forth and holding myself together. And when we are that tired, that afraid, that close to something we cannot control, we look for threats we can name. We look for enemies we can confront. Because a clear enemy feels more bearable than a situation that has no villain at all. My mother was not doing anything wrong in that alcove. She was doing something extraordinary. But I almost turned it into something ugly because I didn't stop long enough to ask before I reacted. That is the part I keep sitting with. Not as a punishment, but as a lesson I genuinely needed. There is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with how much you know or how quickly you think. It is the intelligence that pauses before it concludes. The intelligence that holds space for the possibility that what you are seeing is not the whole picture. My mother had it in abundance. She spent 6 weeks in quiet, careful, relentless work without telling a single person. Not because she was hiding something, but because she understood that actions matter more than announcements. She didn't talk about what she was trying to do. She just did it. Every single day. And Daniel Reeves, a man who owed our family absolutely nothing, responded to that kind of integrity. He didn't agree to donate because someone pressured him or made him feel guilty. He agreed because my mother was honest with him, patient with him, and respectful of his right to say no. She treated him like a person with a full life of his own, not like a solution to her problem. And in return, he made one of the most generous decisions one human being can make for another. That is cause and effect in its most real form. Not magical, not mysterious. Just the straightforward result of someone choosing to act with honesty and decency and not stopping when it got hard. I think about the word resilience a lot differently now than I did before all of this. I used to think resilience meant surviving hard things, enduring, getting through. But watching my mother through those 8 months changed that definition for me. Resilience isn't just endurance. It is the decision to keep building something even when you have no guarantee it will stand. It is the willingness to make 100 phone calls knowing that any one of them might be the last no before the yes. It is love translated into action, quietly, without an audience, without applause, without anyone even knowing what it cost you. Claire thought she was protecting her family when she picked up that phone in the hospital lobby. And in her own way, she was trying to. But the protection her family actually needed was already being built, quietly and completely, by the woman sitting in that alcove. Sometimes the bravest thing happening in any room is the thing no one can see.